Good morning. My name is Natalie Gosnell. I'm Assistant Professor of Physics here at Colorado College. On behalf of the Academic Events Committee, I'd like to welcome you all to Block 4 and to our first Monday Speakers Series today. The Academic Events Committee welcomes your suggestions for our speakers for the next academic year, and so you can submit any of those suggestions or nominations through the Academic Events Committee website. Before we begin, let us acknowledge that we are gathered on the unceded land of the Ute peoples. The earliest documented peoples of this land also include the Apache, Arapaho, Comanche, and Cheyenne. Colorado College was founded upon colonialist practices, including the exclusion and erasure of indigenous peoples, people who are still here. In making this acknowledgement, we seek to honor the past, present, and future of the Ute peoples, those who have stewarded this land for generations. As part of today's discussion, we must remember that our current climate crisis is a result of ongoing legacies of destructive and extractive colonialism. Together, we must grapple with this violent past in order to dismantle these legacies, move towards reconciliation, and bravely meet our environmental future. Through our time together today, I invite you all to consider your place on campus and in our world through this context, reflecting on the communities of which you are a part, because we cannot face our current challenges alone. At the end of the panel, please allow yourself to continue to be invested, continue to be connected, and be respectful to those around you by staying for and engaging with the time allotted for questions. Now, to begin our discussion, please join me in welcoming Colorado College Provost Alan Townsend, who will provide additional context for our event and introduce our guest. Thank you.
Morning, everyone. Thank you, Natalie, not just for the introduction, but for those really wonderful comments to set the stage. That was perfect. I want to start today with a couple of more thank yous as well. First, my thanks to Ian Johnson, our Director of Sustainability and the Sustainability Program in general, for helping to make today's event possible. Thank you, Ian. And also to the Cushing family, to Aaron and Molly and their mother Joan. Aaron and Molly are both alums of Colorado College, and the family has generously provided support that also makes today possible. Thank you for that. Those of you who know me know I care very deeply about today's subject, and I'm thrilled to see it be part of our first Monday series. It's also a real honor for me today to be able to introduce our distinguished guest. But before I do that, I want to explain a little bit what's going to happen today and also introduce two of your own. As you probably have surmised from the setup on the stage, this is not just going to be a talk today, but rather a conversation. And it's going to be a conversation with our guest today, hosted by two current Colorado College students, to Mejia Daniels and Lily Weisgold. Mejia and Lily, if you want to come on out and take your seats. Both who have been really, really actively involved in all kinds of things on campus. Including their leadership around climate issues at CC. So I'm grateful to you both for that. Now let me get on to our guest today. Carter Roberts is, as I think you all know already, was the president and CEO of the World Wildlife Fund, which is in turn the world's largest network of international conservation organizations working across, no kidding, 100 different countries with more than now, I think, 5 million members of WWF. Carter received his BA from Princeton and went on to do an MBA at Harvard Business School after that. And he spent 15 years at the Nature Conservancy in a leadership role there. So he's really spent the majority of his career providing leadership for environmental organizations. And he joined the World Wildlife Fund in 2004. The importance of this organization in conservation and climate in this entire world today honestly can hardly be overstated. I could use up all of the allotted time today, which would not make me very popular, just to go over everything that has happened at WWF under Carter's leadership, which has been the last 15 years. But let me share just a couple of highlights this morning, of which he's justifiably proud. WWF led conservation efforts in Nepal and in surrounding countries aimed at increasing tiger populations. And if you missed the news last year, it came out for follow-up studies that in Nepal, the population has more than doubled over that time period, which is no small feat. That took a lot of hard work to pull off. The organization also led what's truly the largest conservation project in the world, and that is the creation of a series of parks and protected areas across the Amazon that now amount to well over 100 million acres. If you need context for that, it's now a lot bigger than the state of California, which is not small. Critically important today for what's going on in the Amazon at this moment. And as you're going to hear more about today, WWF has been deeply involved in climate advocacy and policy work for a long time, certainly very strongly so under Carter's leadership, including taking a role in the creation and the expansion of the We Are Still In movement. And by the way, if you don't know, Colorado College is a signatory to the We Are Still In Declaration. Finally, just a personal note here. As I've come to learn over the last few years, Carter is not just a terrific leader in the environmental world, he is a deeply kind and really, really good human being. I'm very grateful for him to take the time out of a busy schedule to be here today, so please join me in welcoming Carter Roberts.
Thank you so much for your wonderful introduction, Alan. To begin this conversation, we wanted to discuss just a little bit about the inspiration for this talk. In December of 2018, Lily and I stood with the Colorado College delegation at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. While the US president has pulled out of the Paris Agreement, we felt as if we still had a place as a part of the We Are Still In initiative, which was catalyzed by the World Wildlife Fund. Surrounded by an estimated 30,000 other individuals, we aspired to participate in a process that would revolutionize an implementable framework to the Paris Agreement. Tangibly, this convention symbolized optimism and immense hope that is connected with its initiation of seemingly historic climate agreements. However, intangibly, this conference for me encompassed a great deal of pain. That pain is a result of how the climate crisis will forever change people's lives. You see, climate change directly threatens our human fascination with the concept of forever. A concept that for generations has captured our imagination, fed our hope, and driven us towards the unknowns promised by an inevitable future. But what happens when we're faced with the brink of destruction? What will occur when we're faced with the front lines of a climate crisis which challenges our very own fascination and desire for forever? At the convention, I heard of unspeakable remorse, cries of animosity, and deep levels of frustration, which results when climate migrants and refugees are forcibly displaced from their homelands by sudden and slow onset environmental disasters. While apathetic policymakers seemingly stood idly by, unwilling to agree on the creation of implementable climate policies. At the end of this experience, a common theme emerged, a demand rather, to continue a conversation that began last December so that the voices on the front lines of the climate crisis will not remain unheard or solely exist within the walls of that convention. So today, our college has come together, not solely to declare that we are still in the Paris Agreement, but rather, and more importantly, to continue our collective conversation on climate change. And so with that bit on the inspiration for this event, we would like to ask you, Mr. Roberts, as an individual committed to a lifetime of environmental work and service, What inspires your continued dedication to this field?
Wow. Yeah, you know, I think, you know, I've been in this field for 30 years, and I don't think anyone would be in this field if you weren't born with some measure of faith that you have it within your power to change the narrative and the outcome that we see either at a local level or a global one. I don't think I'd be in this field if I wasn't in some measure quite hopeful that at the same time we have to call it like it is, that things in the world are going to change utterly, but they're not really, it's not a black or white, it's shades of gray, and that there are real bright spots out there in the world that I see where things are getting done, where governments and individuals and even businesses, yes, businesses, are doing really cool things that give me hope that at the end of the day, we can change the trajectory of things to, I don't know how many of you were watching the video behind us. It was something that we produced with David Attenborough. But what a gift to live in this glorious planet and to have the ability, each one of us in ways large and small, to influence the outcome, but it's going to require us to do things differently. But the thing that keeps me going is getting stuff done with a really cool group of people. And it is the, you know, seizing an opening to get something done. And so this past year, actually the past 6 years, we've been working on protecting the headwaters of the Amazon, which is indigenous reserves. It's a series of parks. We've been working with the government of Peru. I don't know how many of you know how many presidents Peru has had in the past 10 years. A lot. And the government was constantly changing. And at the end of all that, we were able to come together and pull together a deal in which 61 indigenous communities were guaranteed title to their land. We helped expand the system of parks at the headwaters of the Amazon, equal to about 15% of Peru, and then finance it. It all came together in a closing at the headwaters of the Amazon. It happened on my birthday, which is not necessarily convenient. And on my birthday, all these amazing people who worked there for decades came together, signed a piece of paper, committed. We all rejoiced. There was tears in people's eyes. And then we all went out at dusk and floated down the river and saw all these amazing creatures. And at the end of the day, we came back and they had a birthday cake for me. And they'd actually brought in two because they knew one would get destroyed in transit. And the one that remained, we celebrated what happened and what we did. And it was because of all these people keeping faith that we could do something really cool. So what keeps me in this? Moments like that. And if I could just have a few more moments like that, I'll stay in this job until they get rid of me.
So we've touched on this a little bit, but could you briefly go over the impetus and vision of We Are Still In and describe how it fits into the World Wildlife Fund's broader mission?
Yeah, so we were founded, I love studying the creation story of institutions. Like, I'm fascinated. How did CC come to be what it is? What was the moment, what was the conversation back in the 60s where people said, you know, we ought to teach differently? And I actually wish that I had gone to school here. I think it's so cool, the way you guys learn. But we were born out of concern that we were going to lose the Serengeti. And we were born at the beginning to keep places like that intact. But now our mission is to create a future where people and nature both flourish. And so we've gone from caring about species and places to caring about the communities that live there, to then thinking more deeply, if you want to keep places like the Amazon intact, what does it require? Well, you can create a bunch of parks, but then you've also got to think about how is food being grown there and conditions and how it's grown. You got to think about infrastructure and how it's designed. You got to think about global markets. And at the end of the day, you got to think about climate change. And so we've evolved from the really local to the really global, because if we don't do all of that, we're not going to win. And at the end of the day, the game is to keep this planet intact because it's our home, kind of put simply. You know, there's the beauty of it, but at the end of the day, this is our home. And so for us, we worked really hard at Paris and in Copenhagen and in Kyoto and all those conferences and parties to get the nations of the world to come together. So when Paris happened, that was a big deal. And at the time, there were only 2 countries that were not party to the Paris Agreement. Nicaragua, does anybody know the other one? North Korea. North Korea and Nicaragua were the 2 countries. Since then, North Korea and Nicaragua have joined the Paris Agreement. And now there's only one country that's pulled out, and that's the United States, which is inconceivable as an issue that's one of the #1 issues in world diplomacy, one of the #1 issues in terms of security and stability of the world. And how is it possible that we could pull out of this agreement? It's really shocking. So as we actually pulled on every lever we could to convince Donald Trump to stay in, including talking to CEOs, talking to the Pope, talking to all these individuals around the world who we thought could have influence. And at the end of the day, the decision would be to pull out. And we thought that might happen, and in advance of that, we secured the domain name We Are Still In. And a very young guy that we hired out of the Obama administration teed this up over the course of a weekend, actually managed to work with Mayor Bloomberg and groups like Ceres, and then rapidly pulled together all these parts of our country that do not believe our country is defined by one person. And we wanted to send a signal to the rest of the world, and also to send a signal to ourselves that we are still going to solve this problem. And to date, we now have 2/3 of the American economy and 2/3 of the American public represented by the mayors, the governors, the businesses, the universities, and the faith-based groups, and the indigenous groups that have signed on to this. And that is pretty cool. Now, and I love the fact that you have a banner on We Are Still In hanging in your campus. I love the fact that you're one of the first signatories to We Are Still In. We have 353 universities. But make no mistake, We Are Still In is just a statement. It's a commitment. And I think you probably all know that making a commitment is not the same as executing against the commitment. And so the work now is to take We Are Still In and have it translate to action and to deliverable emission reductions, and to use that coalition. We call it a subnational coalition, which has now been replicated in Europe and in India, in Mexico, and elsewhere, to drive for the regulations that we need, because every country still needs federal regulations. And so I would ask all of you, and I think what Colorado College has done on your climate emissions is amazing, but to just ask, what are you going to do to take what you've done and pivot to affecting the big moments in the world, whether it's the update of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, the update of the Paris commitments, or there's this little event happening next November. And you ought to really think about, how do you translate your commitment through We Are Still In to action that's not just local, but action that has far greater ramifications that are global.
So accountability is a key part of upholding the Paris Agreement and mitigating the climate crisis. How have the World Wildlife Fund's management practices changed over the years to incorporate accountability, and what lessons do those changes lend to mitigating the climate crisis?
Beware of those moments when people make beautiful proclamations and nothing happens. And the only way you can get through that is if there are real systems of accountability, consequences for either hitting the number, positive consequences, or missing it. And so at WWF, we're very goal-based. Like, I ask every single one of our employees to set goals and then to track those goals over the course of the year, and then at the end of the year in your performance review, you're evaluated against your progress toward those goals. And we ladder those up to the SDGs and what difference we're making against the SDGs, or the difference we're making in the context of the Paris Agreement. So accountability matters. Accountability matters. Like, the best companies include in their performance review of their leadership and their staff a measure of what they've done against sustainability. And it is part of the way their merit increase and their bonuses are evaluated at the end of the year. That's accountability. Accountability is when BlackRock says, we'll lend you that money, we'll invest in you, but only if you provide tangible evidence that you're diversifying your board and you've got a science-based target to reduce your emissions. That's accountability. And the ultimate accountability is whether or not voters vote for somebody or not based on what they've done. And so for us, accountability is huge. It's everything. Like, look at those announcements. What you're really looking for is if people engineered how they translate that announcement to making a measurable difference at the end of the day. So that's how we think about it.
So Carter, I know from our personal discussions, you're really looking forward to the next question. Carter and I, in fact, started a debate on this question last night, which was great.
Do you really have to talk about that?
I know. But with that, I want to ask you, it's evident that climate change is a continued process of colonization. How does the World Wildlife Fund reduce the disproportionate impact that the climate crisis is having on women, indigenous peoples, communities of color, and nations with historically low emissions?
Okay, I'm going to duck your question temporarily, and then I'm going to come back to it. I don't know how many of you have read this book called The Spirit Level. Anybody know that book? The spirit level is something, it's the British term for a carpenter's tool that has a little bubble in the middle where you can really see if something is level or not. The spirit level, there was a group of scientists who were trying to figure out why is it that certain countries in Europe have a greater preponderance of bad things, murder rate, child mortality, alcoholism, you name it. And why do other countries have less? And their theory was that the wealthier a country, measured in terms of GDP, the less bad stuff they would have, their citizens would prosper, and the poorer they'd have more bad stuff. And what they realized was they ran the regression analysis, and there was no correlation at all, none. And so they went back to the drawing board and they redid their analysis, and they instead measured an index of all those bad things and the preponderance of bad things per capita against that country's income inequality. And bam, it was a straight line, all the way from Scandinavian countries and Japan with low income inequality and very few bad things to the countries with really high income inequality like the UK. In the following year, they updated the analysis and they added the United States, and they had Scandinavia, the UK, and the United States was way up there in the rafters. And so this whole business of inequality in the context of issues like climate change and impacts is huge. And you can imagine in the Conference of Parties, there are lots of voices heard, heads of state, business leaders, the youth, like Greta. But the voices that often aren't heard are the voices of indigenous people, people from small countries that are disproportionately affected by climate change. They don't have the ability to move, they don't have the resources to adapt. And so the two sides of climate change are mitigation, or reducing emissions, and adaptation, or enabling communities to adjust and adapt. And guess which one of those two gets all the money? It's the mitigation part. It's the building of renewable energy plants. It's the building of infrastructure. It's all of that. The adaptation part, which tends to the truly vulnerable in the world, they're big money commitments that have been made but not honored as much. And so what do we do about that? We increasingly, throughout our work, I think Alan mentioned we work in 100 countries. We have 28 offices in Indonesia. It's a very long archipelago of islands. A lot of our work is about elevating the voices and the impact on local communities, and then making sure that their voices are heard in the design of programs. This morning, yesterday morning, I got a call from our head of programs who just come out of the heart of Salanga, which is a park in the middle of the DRC in Africa, which is the size of Costa Rica. It has no roads. It is thoroughly forested. It is full of different indigenous groups. There are 1 million people who live in the heart of this place, along with the world's population of bonobos and rare animals, large and small. And what we talked about is, how do you make sure that in whatever vision you have for that part of the world, they have a seat at the table, those people, in designing and implementing and evaluating that work. And so we desperately need the world's agreements on climate and our work to ensure that local communities, that they have a seat at the table in designing and implementing and evaluating that work, and making sure those voices are heard throughout. That was a really long answer to your question. But I really recommend you read The Spirit Level. It's a deeply insightful book about the way the world is, the way it is today.
So the next question kind of connects to what you were just discussing, but ultimately is the pinnacle of what we're trying to get at today. So given the inevitability of climate change, how do we move from conversations similar to the ones that we're having today to tangible actions?
By the way, I've had a lot of great conversations today in Professor Cornelius's class and with your communication department and here and last night. Conversations matter, but as we said, they don't matter as much as action. And I think all of you, I love the example you set at Colorado College with what you've done around We Are Still In, what you've done around your carbon footprint, and translating that from how you source energy to the food you buy, to transportation and more. That's all hugely important. And I love the fact that CC takes the time to think about the springs and the parts of the springs that don't have the resources or the benefits or privilege that you have here. I love that. I think we talked in your class this morning about the Sustainable Development Goals. There's 17 of them with 196 sub-goals in the world, ranging from food waste to child mortality and having that to education and more. To me, the secret is to pick something, pick one thing you want to change in the world, and then run through your mind, what does it really take to move the needle on that, not just locally, but globally, and then really understand the system, the institutions, the levers to pull, and then find a way to pursue that using where you sit, your voice, your relationships, and every one of you are going to go out there in the world, and you're going to have interesting jobs ranging from business, to academia, to government, to NGOs. And to me, the greatest, there are a couple of really important skills that I find in our work that are fundamental. One is connecting the dots between sectors. If you have the ability to connect science to business to policy, amazing things happen. And so to develop that skill set to connect the dots is super important, but also to think in terms of systems and to look for those, one metaphor is acupuncture. Where do you put the needle to change the whole thing? Or what's the thing that you can pull on that really creates change? To really look for those things. In whatever issue you pick, look for those things that you can pull on, and then work like heck through your networks and your smarts to affect that change, not just in your own life, but in the institution where you work as the next order magnitude. And then think about that institution, not just its own footprint, but the power it has. So if you're what's the power of a university? It's through the science, the research, and the talent you have. What's the power of a marketing company? It's its voice, its ability to change the dialogue. What's the power of BlackRock? It's all the money that they deploy. So think about how you, not think about your own footprint, but think about the power of the institution where you work and its ability to be a lever to make greater change possible.
So speaking to the video that we saw earlier of Greta, in the past year, younger generations have become far more visible and assertive in response to the climate crisis all over the world, from Fridays for the Future to Extinction Rebellion. Youth are demonstrating and calling for tangible actions to address and respond to climate change. Do you see these actions having an impact on international and domestic climate policy, and if so, how?
Well, that's called a big fat pitch. I mean, you know, I spent a week at the UN General Assembly this fall, and I met with the biggest funders of the environment in the world. I met with heads of state from Boris, who's, you know, really articulate about the environment, believe it or not, to the Prime Minister of Bhutan, to the President of Costa Rica. The only thing people wanted to know was, did I meet Greta? That's like the only question. Did you meet Greta? And Greta is a force. In some ways, it's not surprising. Scandinavia is brilliant at elevating the voice of young people. And my colleague organizations have always done that in a way that's really amazing. You know, at WWF, we have a program. We have 8 million activists in the United States, in addition to our members, who get involved in issues, whether they're writing letters or engaging through social media on different issues. But I've gone to call on senators. I've gone to call on some of the crustiest senators with like really brilliant scientists and young people. And all the ions change in the room when there is a young person in the room talking truth to power, telling their story. I mean, you think that I'm just saying this to you, but it's true. It really profoundly changes everything. And we're now beginning to see protests in different parts of the world, which, by the way, that's not the only way you can make your voice heard is through protests. There are other ways as well, but you're beginning to see young people make their voices heard, either in boardrooms or on the streets or in the media or in the context of new startups and in the context of family discussions over the kitchen table. And so when I look at the moments coming up in the coming years, I think it's one of the most important things that gives me hope about changing the way certain decisions or events happen.
Thank you. Shall we wrap it up?
No, I think we have time for
Okay.
two more.
So
Are you tired of asking questions?
Yeah, I'm bored. I'm sorry. I want to leave. I want to go have lunch.
All right.
Yeah. So looking beyond our time at Colorado College, how can we leverage our work in different sectors to address climate change? And you've touched on this a little bit, but then additionally, if you could give us each one piece of advice to take out of this conversation, what would it be?
Each one of you, one piece of advice.
Yeah.
We'll go around.
I've already talked about kind of my notion of how individuals can think about what they do individually and more broadly. But my dad gave me one bit of advice when I was thinking about my life and career. He said, you know, two things matter: how much you learn and serving something bigger than you are. And we talked about that. But I would additionally say that it really, really matters who you work with. It really matters who you work with. I would rather be digging clams with a magnificent group of people than I would pursuing a noble cause with a bunch of people who are jerks. And I can tell you from direct experience, really think about who you work with. If you're starting a company, think about that. If you're joining an institution, think about that. I was talking to somebody this morning who was serving coffee downtown, who was involved in a scuffle. and a conflict on the sidewalk and trying to break it up. And she said, you know, I just knew working here, this is part of the deal. And I said, why do you work here? She said, I love my boss, and I love my coworkers, and I have the ability to be a part of that. So that would be one thing I would say is really, you know, when I talked about that moment on my birthday, it wasn't so much the thing that I was signing, although that was transcendental, but it was the people I was with, and just that matters immensely in whatever you choose to do next. And I would just say, remember that. And the other thing I'd say is whatever choices you make in your life, just make sure they're your own and not somebody else's. I went out and I polled my parents and their friends, what job do you think I ought to take? I would not advise that. Make your own choice based on who you are, and make your own choice based on what is unique about you. And I would urge all of you to just think about your life. I mean, if you work in the White House, I hate to tell you this, you're going to have to wear a suit. That's just part of the deal. But you should be fully, wholly yourself wherever you happen to work. I mean, there's certain things you have to do, but don't try to assimilate too much, because your unique voice and the unique thing that you bring to whatever problem it happens to be is your power. And it's the one thing I've learned in my life where I've tried to fit in certain places where I've been, and then I've been much more unfettered. I would urge you to think about that and whatever you choose to do next, because I've learned in our work, our organization's all about diversity, and diversity of life on Earth, diversity of places, diversity of cultures, but it's really the diversity of talent we have, and that is the thing that is our greatest strength and our greatest skill, as long as we are mindful of that in everything that we do. So that's all I got.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you.
So we do have one last question for you today, and that is, what is a question of utmost importance that we've missed, and what would your answer be to that?
Okay, there's so many ways I could go on this, but the one question I would say is, if I were here at the moment that you voted for your mascot, how would I have voted? And I've spent a lot of time on tigers and restoring tigers and populations in the world. I'm here to tell you, at no point in time in the history of the planet were tigers ever in Colorado. Okay? So give it up for the cutthroat trout. And
That was truly great. So to conclude, we just want to thank Carter for his presence here today, as well as we're immensely grateful for the entire COP24 delegation and the faculty, administrators, and donors who were central in making this event a possibility. Can I just have a round of applause for them really quickly? Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
you guys were great.
So as you know, we usually open this up for audience questions, but before we do that, we're going to end things a little bit differently today and present you with a few thoughts. Climate change is an individual issue and a collective issue. It is an environmental, an economic, a political, and a governance issue. It is a food scarcity, immigration, water quality, mass extinction, and a global health issue. Climate change is not just an environmental issue, it is a human rights issue. And the climate crisis truly sees no bounds, as it is eclipsing every corner of our globe. However, when boiling it down, The climate change at its fundamental basis is simple. It begins with the concept of climate. It's a fabric that unites us. And when paired with conceptions of change, we see connotations of destruction, erosion, and large-scale environmental decay emerge. But what if we transformed our conceptions on change? For historically, when paired with human rights movements, ideas of change have often symbolized progression and not degeneration. So we would like to challenge you to do just a little bit more today than declare that we are still in. We would like to ask you to redefine your conceptions and contributions to change so that collectively we can resiliently address the climate crisis. And now we'd like to open it up for audience questions.
Hello, my name is Joshua. I'm a first year studying here, and first of all, I would just like to thank you for this amazing talk about the global actions that humanity has taken in order to address climate change. And the context for my question in particular is that there's an ongoing debate right now over whether the greatest power to address climate change lies within the power of the individual through stuff like the hand of the markets versus the power of national governments through things like environmental and economic policies. How would you respond to this debate?
I remember once I was with a guy named Louis Pugh who was swimming across the Arctic. We were on an island off the northern tip of Norway above the Arctic Circle. And I have a tendency to swim in places like that myself, but he was swimming across the Arctic, and it's a way of raising consciousness about the Arctic. And we sat around, we were at a table in this little research station, and I was with colleagues, and I was trying to make the point, it's the inside game that matters. Getting in the smoke-filled back rooms where decisions are made. And I asked him, I said, what's the most important thing you've done this past week? Because, this past year, he'd been tweeting about his trip and everything he was doing. And he said, yeah, the most important thing I did was to meet with the Prime Minister of the UK and convince him to put a big number on the table in Paris. And I looked at my colleagues and I said, see, there you go. It's the inside game that matters, not the big mass market game. And then he said, of course, I never would have gotten that meeting if I didn't have all my followers on Twitter. And so I kind of realized that unless individuals in great numbers are calling on something to happen, that those institutions, whether it's governments or businesses, are not going to act. And so you got to have both. You got to have both. And as you think about, be really clear-minded about the importance of individuals, but also how you affect what happens. And then I think you all know that legendary moment between Martin Luther King and President Johnson, where MLK is hammering him on certain changes that he needed to make. And Johnson said, I know that's the right thing to do. Now, make me do it. So think about that. If you ever question the role of individuals and their voice, it matters a lot. It matters in markets, it matters with businesses, and it matters in a political setting.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I just wanted to ask a question about, I guess, how we combat things like the fact that ExxonMobil knew how drastically climate change was going to affect everything and how much they were contributing to it back in the 70s, and then lobbied millions of dollars over the next few decades, denying the existence and trying to squash any efforts to combat climate change, and the fact that there are hundreds more companies just like them in any sector across the board that have a vested interest in continuing or in continuing climate change, basically, and how you think we should combat those companies.
It's interesting when you look at the, I'll make one comment before I answer your question, which is, if you look at how legislation passes Congress, and you look at kind of the points of leverage, often it's the biggest employers in a state who have or the biggest donors to a senator, or the biggest, kind of the biggest groups of people in a state that can really influence the vote that that person, the way she pulls the lever and voting going one way or another. And so the thing that I would just say is beware of demonizing business writ large. But the question you ask is a different question, because you need business to be arguing for the regulations that we need at some point. But the question that you asked about the liability of companies who willingly pursue a course of action knowing that the damages that would occur is a really interesting one. And right now, one of the things that is driving different institutions to the table are called these legal liability lawsuits. These liability lawsuits that are beginning to be filed in states by their attorneys general, are much feared, because when you think about the impacts on people of cigarette companies, for instance, or of companies that played a disproportionate role in climate change, if any one of those goes through and establishes the precedents, then that will change everything. Look at the Sackler family right now and what's happened to them, and the role that their business played in creating the opioid epidemic. They have now basically trying to cut a deal to fold their whole companies and devote all their wealth to addressing the epidemic that they've created. But that is a result of lawsuits. And so, and look at the role of the courts right now in staving off some of the worst things that the current administration is doing to try to undo actions in previous administrations. Thank God for the courts, and thank God for the ability of law to hold people accountable. We talk about accountability. I think those are some of the tools that will be really important in the years ahead.
When we talk about climate change, we talk a lot about individual participation and mobilization. But in my opinion, I don't think anything can really get done without big government intervention. Just like, what's your stance on that? Do you think that we need governments to act, or do you think there can be a point where governments aren't acting and we can actually take the matter into our own hands?
I don't know what you mean by taking matters into your own hands, but let me just say, if you want to take matters into your own hands, vote. And get everyone you know to register to vote. And get everyone you know to register to vote for the things that you care about. You can't get away from the role of government anywhere in the world. I mean, you know, government is fundamental. I've worked with businesses, I've worked with communities, I've worked with all of them. We have done the most brilliant community-based work in different parts of the world. It doesn't last unless there are governments that actually acknowledge those communities, recognize them, and then support whatever they're trying to do over the long run. So communities really matter, but government, whatever form it takes, city, state, federal, I'm telling you, it is fundamental. And if you're going to take, even, you know, those who argue for revolution, at the end of the day, they're not going through a revolution to have no government. They just want a new one. So I would just say, taking matters into your own hand, to me, my translation of that is use every bit of influence and power you have to change the course of events in elections that occur and in the decisions that your representatives make at the moments that it matters the most. And there are some really consequential moments that we face in the world today. So that's, I don't think you can get, you can't get past government and the fundamental role that it plays.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, my name's Charlotte. In order to have a global energy revolution, you need a lot of batteries, and most of the lithium in the world is in Bolivia. With the kind of coup that just happened and the change in power, where do you see that going, and do you think there's an equitable way to harvest that lithium in order to create a global energy kind of revolution type of thing, or to make enough batteries for all of the solar energy that we're going to need?
I'm sorry, with the noise, the rustling in the room, I couldn't hear your question.
Yeah, so the question is there we are. Most of the lithium for batteries in the world is in Bolivia. With the current coup that just happened and the change in power, where do you see future distribution and equitable distribution of that lithium and equitable harvesting of that coming?
Yeah. You know, it's an interesting fact that whether you're talking about batteries or other real things that seem really fundamental to us today, like phosphorus for agriculture, pick lithium for batteries, pick whatever, those things are distributed in the world in really strange ways. They're unevenly distributed. There are pockets of those rare earths or key resources in the world. And make no mistake that all the governments in the world see that really clearly, and their dependence. You know, whether you're talking about North Africa and phosphorus or lithium in Bolivia, they all see that really clearly. And there is right now enormous geopolitical efforts for countries, really powerful ones, to make sure they get that stuff, either in whatever way they can, so that their people are not vulnerable in the future. And the equity of whether you're Bolivia or the Amazon for biodiversity that leads to cancer drug breakthroughs, you know, there are all kinds of versions of this. Some countries are better at negotiating that. There's some agreements that are better at negotiating that. But it is fundamental to make sure that the powerful don't get what they need and the poor are left with nothing. And one of the most interesting versions of that, I'm going to pivot here, so just I'm pivoting. So if you look at immigration in the world, and particularly immigrants streaming into Europe, and by the way, the UN High Commission on Refugees estimates that number is only going to double in the coming years. In fact, I think that's a gross underestimation. And it's going to affect the United States. It's going to affect lots of parts of the world, because with climate change and resource scarcity, if people can't grow the food they need to feed their families, and governments with really bad governance, the wealthy will get all the good stuff, and the poor will have not much. And they'll have to move. And they'll either move within a country or they'll move between countries. And I think that's one of the biggest things you guys are going to have to deal with in the coming decades, is the growing immigration and refugees from different parts of the world, because the things that they need to depend upon locally aren't available to them, which is a consequence of bad governance, loss of natural resources, and climate change. And so figuring that out, I think, is one of the most fundamental things for us, whether it's lithium or food or phosphorus or whatever. And I think it's, you know, believe it or not, the part of the federal government that is our closest partner, like the part of the government that really gets our work the most, is the Department of Defense. Because they run all the long-term models and they see the profound importance of climate change and natural resources to security and stability in the world. So it's a great question. It's a much bigger issue. Thanks.
Thank you.
And I don't know at what point, I don't know who's calling the clock.
One more question.
You have one more question?
Just
Okay.
a couple more minutes.
One of the first things you said was that one of your goals is to have humans and nature like living in harmony. I was wondering if you could speak to human population growth and how that fits in with climate change, and like how can we live in harmony when our population is growing at an exponential rate and we're just kind of taking over the planet?
Yep. I am surprised the population question took this long, but thanks for asking it. I fundamentally think, there is something that I call the basic math of the planet, and other people refer to it in different ways, but we live in this finite planet. And it's finite in terms of natural resources, it's finite in terms of the climate, it's finite. It's like that moment when the first astronauts went to space and turned around and saw this blue marble floating out there. It just takes your breath away that it's so small and so finite. And most people focus on the growth of population as being the thing that's going to strain us and our ability to survive. And I think, I don't know what the latest estimate is, 11.7 billion people we're going to get to eventually, depending. The population question is an interesting one, particularly when you look at China and India and the number of people they have and the measures they've taken. You know, the country of Nigeria, their population is going to double. They're going to be bigger than the United States by the middle of this century. And the question is, where is their food going to come from? But I think most people who think about this, and I saw a great presentation by Sam Myers of Harvard the other day at this symposium we had about health and the environment, that it's really this equation of population and consumption. Because if all the people we add on the world want to live like we do here in the United States, we are in deep trouble. So if you want to control population, which people are you talking about? You talking about people in Africa or people here or where? Because our footprint on the planet is 10 times, 20 times some other parts of the world. And so the real question, population is important, but when you look at the change in population versus the change in consumption per capita, the number that's changing the most in the world is consumption. It is the amount of food we think we need, energy we think we need, water we think we need and use, how big our house needs to be. You know, it's like that's the bigger question to me. Like, population's really important. There's some great groups that work on that. PSI is a great group who does some incredibly innovative work. And that's important. If somebody asked me the other day, if you want to keep Africa intact, what's the one thing? And I would say the one thing is educating young women. Because young women have the ability to make better decisions about family planning, and young women manage money better. And young women are like the secret to the future of Africa. But, thank you, it happens to be true. But on the other hand, we should think really hard about how do we influence consumption and what kind of food we eat and how much of it and what's enough. And so I think that's something that population is really important to address. Consumption, I would argue, is even bigger. And but it's a great question because it's all about figuring out that math and keeping the planet intact so we can have the amazing life we have right now. I mean, I woke up this morning in the Springs and I looked out, there was Pikes Peak, the sun was shining. You know, it's like this amazing college. Do you guys know how lucky you are to be here? I mean, it's like an extraordinary place. There's so many parts of the world that aren't like this. And they're just so different. And I think figuring out what are the lives we lead and what are the incentives and policies we create to manage that, I think is even as important as population and family planning. So thanks for that question. It's really good one.
Thank you.